There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in houses where someone has stopped trying. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of sleep or peace or a Sunday morning before the rest of the world wakes up. This is a different silence altogether. It is the silence of a person who has learned that speaking changes nothing, who has practiced being small for so long that smallness has become the shape of them, who moves through rooms the way water moves around stones, not because the stones are worthy of the effort, but because going around is easier than breaking. Mara Linden had lived inside that silence for 9 years. She was 20 years old on the morning it ended. Not ended gently, not ended with any of the ceremony or softness that endings sometimes carry when people have the decency to treat each other like human beings. It ended the way Frank Kessler did most things, quietly, efficiently, and without explanation. The way a man removes a piece of furniture he has decided he no longer needs. She came home from a double shift at Sinclair's diner at 4 in the afternoon. Her feet hurt the way feet hurt after 8 hours on a linoleum floor, carrying plates of eggs and coffee and the particular weight of other people's ordinary days. Her apron was in her bag. She still smelled like the grill. The front door opened with her key. That was the first thing she noticed, that the front door still opened, and she did not yet understand what that meant. She went upstairs. Her bedroom door had a padlock on it, a new one, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $8, the steel bright and clean against the old painted wood of the door. She stood in the hallway and looked at it for a moment. Her hand reached out and touched the shackle. Cold. The metal was cold, and it did not move, and she stood there with her hand on it and understood in the particular way that people understand things they have always known were coming, that this was it. She walked back downstairs. Frank was in the living room. He was watching television, a baseball game. The volume low, the room lit by the blue-white flicker of the screen. He did not look at her when she came in. He had a beer in one hand, and his feet were up on the coffee table. And he looked exactly like a man who had done nothing unusual that day, because for Frank Kessler, this was not unusual. This was simply the next item on a list he had been working through for some time. "Your things are in the driveway," he said. His voice was flat, not angry, not cruel in any demonstrative way, just flat the way a door sounds when it closes and the latch clicks and you are standing on the outside of it. She went outside. A cardboard box sat at the end of the driveway near the mailbox. It held her clothes folded badly, as if someone had done it in a hurry or without care. Her toothbrush, 3 books from the shelf beside her bed, and the framed photograph of her grandmother that had lived on her nightstand since she was 9 years old. The woman with the kind eyes and the straight back, and the expression of a person who had decided long ago that life was worth paying full attention to. The glass on the frame was cracked. She did not know if it had been cracked before. Mara looked at the box. She looked at the house. Her mother was in the kitchen. She could see her through the window, a shape behind the glass standing at the sink. Vivian Linden was 44 years old, and she was standing at the sink with her hands in the dishwater, and she was not moving. Her hands were in the water, and they were still, and she was looking at nothing or looking at the window above the sink, at the piece of the yard she could see from where she stood, or looking at something that existed only inside her own head, in whatever place she had retreated to where Frank's voice did not reach. Mara did not knock on the door. She picked up the box and walked to the end of the driveway and sat down on it and took out her phone. Her hands were steady. She was not crying, and she did not feel on the edge of crying. She had done her crying years ago in the dark of that bedroom, with the door now padlocked shut, pressing her face into her pillow so the sound would not carry through the walls. She had cried quietly and completely, and, for a long time, and somewhere in those years, she had used it all up. What was left was not numbness exactly, it was more like clarity, the particular sharpness of a person who has been waiting for something and now watches it arrive and thinks, yes, there it is exactly as expected. She had $1 in her wallet. She knew this because she had counted her money 3 nights ago. Sitting on the edge of her bed, with the door closed, the way she always counted her money carefully, privately, in the way of a person who has learned that what they cannot see can be taken. She had $722 in a sock at the bottom of her backpack, folded bills, and a roll of quarters she had been saving since she was 16. 4 years of double shifts and breakfast rushes and tired tourists passing through on Route 119, and old men who drank coffee and left $1.50 on the table because that was how they had always done it and were not interested in inflation. But 3 nights ago, she had counted $722. Now, she had $1. She had not been back to her room since then. She had slept at the diner's break room the last 2 nights after closing because Darlene, the night manager, was a woman of practical compassion who asked no questions and left a clean towel on the break room couch without being asked. Mara had not gone back to count her money again because she had not wanted to know. And now she knew anyway, in the way she always eventually knew the things she had been trying not to look at. Frank had gone through her room. She sat on the cardboard box in the driveway and called the one person she could think of. Ruth Alderman answered on the second ring. Ruth was 74 years old and had been coming into Sinclair's diner every morning for 6 years, arriving at 7:15 and sitting in the corner booth by the window and ordering black coffee and rye toast and reading the newspaper the way people read newspapers when they still believe the world is worth paying attention to. She was a small woman with silver hair, cut short and practical, and the kind of directness that some people mistake for coldness, and that is actually its opposite. She said what she meant. She meant what she said. She did not soften things unnecessarily, but she did not harden them either. She had the quality rare in any person, and rarer still in someone who has lived long enough to have reasons not to, of making you feel that what you said mattered to her. Mara had talked to Ruth every morning for 4 years. Not deeply, not intimately, not the way you talk to a therapist or a confessor. The way you talk to someone who is consistently there and consistently kind and who asks how you are and waits for the actual answer. Over 4 years, that adds up to something. Over 4 years, that becomes a kind of knowing that does not require explanation or history or formal declaration. It simply is. I'll be there in 10 minutes, Ruth said when Mara finished talking. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say that was awful or what a terrible thing or any of the other phrases people offer when they want to acknowledge pain without getting close to it. She said she would be there in 10 minutes, and she was there in 8. The car was a Subaru wagon, dark green, with a faded parking permit from the county library on the windshield, and a back seat that smelled like old books and coffee. Ruth pulled up to the driveway and looked at the box, and looked at Mara and did not comment on either. Mara put the box in the back and got in the front, and Ruth pulled out onto the road and drove and did not speak for a full 2 minutes, which was the right thing to do and which not everyone would have known. Then Ruth said, "Tell me," so Mara told her. Not everything. Not the 9 years of Frank's flat voice filling the rooms of that house like bad weather that never fully cleared. Not the particular quality of her mother's absence, the way Vivian had not left, but had simply disappeared in place, the way a photograph fades when you leave it too long in the sun, until the image is still technically there, but the color and the life have drained out of it. She told Ruth the relevant facts. The padlock, the box, the dollar. Ruth listened without interrupting. She drove and she listened. And when Mara finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "There's something I want to show you tomorrow. Tonight you sleep at my house." Ruth's house was a small craftsman bungalow at the edge of town with a porch that wrapped around two sides and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something herbal she kept in a pot on the windowsill. There was a spare bedroom with a quilt on the bed and a reading lamp on the nightstand and a window that looked out at a stand of birch trees. It was a room that had been prepared for guests, not as a performance, but as a genuine readiness. A room that said someone might need this, and I want to be ready when they do. Mara sat at Ruth's kitchen table that evening and drank tea and told the rest of it. She told Ruth about coming home the week after her 16th birthday to find her bedroom had been searched. The careful disorder of it, things moved slightly, not thrown around, because Frank was precise. She had kept her money after that in the lining of her backpack, then in a sock, then in the actual sole of her left work shoe, building a habit of concealment, the way an animal builds a habit of hiding food because the den is not safe. She told Ruth about her mother, about the woman Vivian had been before Frank, a woman who sang in the car and made soup from scratch and had a laugh that was unexpected and genuine and came from somewhere real. And about the woman Vivian had become after the woman who stood at the sink with her hands in the water and did not move. It had happened slowly, so slowly that Mara had not been able to name it. While it was happening only in retrospect, could she see the long, gradual erasure of her mother by a man who needed to be the only real thing in any room he occupied. Ruth listened. She did not offer analysis or judgment or the particular cruelty of people who try to fix things by explaining them. She listened the way Clara Holt had once listened to a 14-year-old girl in A Coal Miner's Daughter who kept skipping school because being at school meant admitting that the life you were living was the actual life, and sometimes that is too much to sit with in a plastic chair for 6 hours a day. But that is a story that comes later. That night, lying in the spare bedroom under Ruth's quilt, with the birch trees moving in the dark, outside the window, Mara did not sleep for a long time. She was not crying. She was thinking with the quiet, methodical precision of a person who has always had to solve problems alone and has gotten good at it. She had $1. She had the $722 that Frank had taken, which was gone, which she would not get back, which she filed in the category of things she had already grieved before they happened. She had the clothes in the box, and the cracked photograph of her grandmother, and her backpack, and her phone, and the particular quality of stillness she had developed over 9 years of learning to exist in a house that did not want her. She was 20 years old. She had nothing. She had everything she had built herself. She fell asleep just before dawn. In the morning, Ruth made eggs and black coffee and toast and set it on the table without ceremony, and they ate and did not speak much. And then Ruth said, "Get your coat." They drove south out of town on Route 119, then turned west on a 2-lane road that followed a creek through a valley where the mountains on both sides came close enough to make the sky feel smaller. Harlan County in October was the kind of beautiful that people who do not live there do not know about. Not the manicured beauty of tourist destinations. The rougher, truer beauty of a landscape that does not care whether you appreciate it. Hardwood forest climbing the mountain slopes, the leaves turning in waves of orange and red, and the deep russet brown of late season. Stone outcroppings above the tree line catching the morning light. The creek running fast and cold over flat gray rocks opaque with the tannins of fallen leaves. Ruth drove without explaining where they were going. Mara did not ask. She watched the landscape and drank her coffee from a thermos Ruth had put in the cup holder and let the morning do what it needed to do. After 40 minutes, Ruth said, "My friend Clara taught school out here." Mara looked at her. One room schoolhouse, little town called Mill Haven, another 12 miles. She taught there from 1947 until the county consolidated the schools in 1971. 24 years. Clara never married, never left. She lived simply and she taught well, and the people of Mill Haven trusted her with their children, which is the largest trust a community can give. Ruth paused, sipped her coffee from her own thermos. She died 2 years ago, 91 years old, sharp until the end. What happened to the school? It sat. The county owns it technically, but they stopped maintaining it when it closed. It's gone through tax auction 3 times. Nobody wants it. The building's been empty since 1971. They're selling it now just to clear the lien. Ruth glanced at her. For $1. Mara turned to look at her fully. $1, Ruth said, to whoever will take responsibility for it. There was silence in the car. The creek had disappeared behind a ridge. The road climbed slightly following the contour of the hill, and the trees on both sides leaned over it, making a tunnel of gold and orange. A hawk sat on a fence post beside the road and watched the car pass with the patient indifference of a creature that has never had to hurry. "Why are you telling me this?" Mara asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, because you need something that's yours, and because Clara's school has been waiting a long time for someone who needs it. She said it plainly, without drama, which was Ruth's way. It was the way she said everything, without decoration. Just the thing itself offered directly like a tool placed in a hand. Mara looked out the window. A one-room schoolhouse. She did not know what that looked like exactly, what condition it was in, whether the roof held or the floor was sound. But she knew what $1 meant. $1 meant possible. $1 meant that the question was not whether she could afford it, but whether she could manage it. And those are different questions entirely, and she had been answering the second kind of question her whole life. "How much does it need?" she asked. "I don't know," Ruth said. "Let's go see." They crossed a narrow bridge over the creek, the planks rattling under the tires, and came around a long bend in the road, and there was Mill Haven. It was the kind of town that existed because people had come to this valley for the coal, and stayed because staying is easier than going, and then the coal left, but the people did not. A gas station with one pump. A Baptist church, white clapboard, the paint peeling at the eaves, but the steeple straight. A general store with a sign that said Greer's in faded red letters, and a hand-lettered cardboard sign in the window advertising live, bait, and propane. 3 dozen houses spread along both sides of the road, some well kept, some, not all of them, carrying the particular dignity of places that have survived more than they should have and are not asking for your sympathy. The school was at the edge of town, set back from the road on a 1/4-acre lot separated from a hayfield by a stone wall so old the mortar had mostly become moss. It was a single-story building roughly 30 feet wide and 40 feet long, built of red brick over a poured concrete foundation. The brick had darkened with decades of weather, but it was solid. You could see that from the road. The mortar lines were tight and uncracked. The roof was standing seam tin that had gone the color of old pewter, and it was intact as far as she could see. A small bell tower sat on the ridge of the roof, open on all 4 sides, the bell long gone, but the bracket still there. 4 tall 6/6 windows ran down each long side, the frames painted white. The paint faded and chalking, but the glass, most of it still in place. A few panes cracked, one missing entirely. Replaced at some point with a piece of plywood that had gone gray with age. The front door was painted dark green, almost black now, and it stood slightly open. Not open the way a door stands open when someone is inside. Open the way a door stands open when it has not been fully closed for a very long time. A large red oak stood beside the building, 3 feet thick at the base, its branches arching over the corner of the roof. Its leaves were the deep burgundy of late October, and some of them had already fallen and lay on the ground around the foundation in a pattern that looked deliberate, like someone had arranged them. The stone step at the front door was worn down in the center in a smooth, shallow curve. 50 years of children's feet, maybe 100. Mara stood on the gravel path and looked at the building for a long time. Ruth waited by the car. She understood that this was the kind of looking that requires quiet. Mara walked to the door and put her hand on it and pushed it open. The smell came first. Old wood and chalk dust and something under both of those. Something she could not name precisely, a sweetness that seemed to come from the bricks themselves, or from the floor, or from the accumulated presence of 1,000 mornings when children had come in from the cold and taken their coats off and sat down and begun. The smell of a place that had been used for learning for a very long time. The interior was a single room. The floor was wide oak planks, 3 inches thick, worn smooth in the paths between the desks, but solid, the kind of wood that gets harder with age and does not apologize for it. Dust lay over everything in a fine, even layer, undisturbed, the record of 53 years of stillness. The walls were plaster over brick, cream-colored, large sections of it cracked, and a section in the back corner where it had fallen away entirely, leaving the brick exposed. The ceiling was pressed tin, each square panel stamped with a geometric pattern painted white. The paint yellowed in places, but the tin itself intact. 2 rows of wooden school desks faced the front wall, the old-fashioned kind with cast iron legs, and a wooden surface that flipped up. They were still in their rows, as if the last class had simply stood up and walked out, and no one had ever come back to rearrange them. Most of them were sound. A few had legs that had rusted loose at the joints. The dust on them was exactly as thick as the dust on everything else, which meant no one had touched them in a very long time. On the front wall, the chalkboard. Full width, floor to ceiling. The dark green slate of it still dark, and even the wood frame around it still tight. Below the chalkboard, the chalk tray still holding a few pieces of chalk. White and yellow. Broken into small pieces, but still recognizably chalk. Beside the chalkboard, tacked to the plaster with small brass tacks that had gone green with verdigris, a map of the United States. Cream-colored paper, the printing faded to near illegibility. The state lines still visible. The major cities still marked. 1965 was printed in small type at the bottom corner. At the back of the room, a cast-iron pot-belly stove sat on a brick hearth. The chimney pipe ran up through the tin ceiling and out the roof. The stove was rusted on the exterior, but the seams looked tight. Beside the stove, a small wooden cabinet stood against the wall. She opened it. Inside, a grade book, its cover buckled with old moisture, the pages wavy but legible. A few pieces of chalk, and a handbell, the kind a teacher rings to call students in from recess. Brass with a turned wooden handle. It had gone dark with oxidation, but when she picked it up and held it, she could feel the weight of it, the realness of it. The sense of an object that had been used so many times, its purpose had become part of its substance. She set it back carefully. The light in the room was extraordinary. The tall windows, though dirty, still admitted long rectangles of morning sun that fell across the desks and the oak floor in warm shapes that moved slowly as the earth turned. Dust floated in those columns of light, turning catching. It looked like snow falling sideways. It looked like something being born. Mara stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. She could feel the room around her the way you can feel the presence of something that has been dedicated to a purpose for a long time. Not haunted, not heavy. Something more like the way a church feels, or a workshop where the same craft has been practiced for generations. The sense that the walls have absorbed something and are still holding it. 70 years of mornings. 70 years of children learning to read in these chairs, under these windows, with this woman standing at this chalkboard in front of this map. She walked to the chalkboard and touched the slate. It was cool under her fingers. Smooth the way only well-used slate is smooth, the microscopic texture worn down by decades of chalk and erasers until it had achieved something close to glass. She picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. She looked at the empty green surface for a moment. Then she set the chalk back down. Not yet. She went back outside. Ruth was sitting on the stone step, her hands around her coffee thermos, looking at the hayfield across the stone wall. The field was still pale gold, the grass not yet laid down by the first real frost, and, beyond it, the mountain wall rose steeply covered in hardwood forest, going orange and red all the way to the ridge. "The foundation's good," Mara said. "Bricks tight, floor solid, all of it. The plaster's cracked in the back corner, maybe a section 8 feet wide. Couple of window panes need replacing. Roof looks sound from inside." Ruth nodded. "It needs electricity, plumbing, a heat source other than that stove." She paused. "The stove might actually be fine. I'd have to have it inspected." Ruth nodded again. "I want it," Mara said. Ruth looked up at her. "Okay." They drove to Greer's General Store, which also served as the county assessor's satellite office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and was on this Thursday staffed by Corbett Finley, who was the county assessor's deputy and had been since approximately the Carter administration. He was a thin man in his late 60s with reading glasses that had been repaired at the bridge with a piece of electrical tape and an expression of practiced neutrality that did not change when Mara walked in and said she wanted to buy the schoolhouse. "You know it hasn't been used since 71, he said. "Yes, sir." "No electric, no water, no septic. Section of plaster off the back wall." "I know." He looked at her over the tape-repaired glasses. He looked at Ruth. He looked back at Mara. She put $1 on the counter. Corbett Finley looked at the dollar. He looked at it for a moment longer than a man looks at something he is simply registering. He looked at it the way you look at a thing when you recognize it, when you have been expecting it and it has finally come. He opened the drawer beneath the counter and reached into it and brought out a small object and placed it beside the dollar on the counter. It was a key. Old iron, about 3 inches long with a simple bow at one end and a bit at the other that had been worn smooth with handling. It was tied with a piece of leather cord that had dried and stiffened with age. Mara looked at it. "Clara Holt left that here in 1971, Corbett said. The day she locked up the school for the last time. She said to give it to whoever bought the building." He paused. "You're the first person who ever has." "What is it open?" Mara asked. Corbett shook his head slowly. "She didn't say." Mara picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, and looked at the simple worn iron of it, the leather cord soft with age. She closed her fingers around it. Corbett pulled a form from the drawer and uncapped a ballpoint pen and began filling it out in the methodical way of a man who has been doing paperwork for 40 years and does not rush any of it. "Welcome to Millhaven," he said. He did not say it like a greeting. He said it like a statement of fact, which it was. They drove back to Ruth's house that evening. The sun had gone behind the mountains, and the valley was in the early blue of dusk, the temperature dropping fast the way it drops in October in the mountains when the sun leaves. Mara held the key in her hand for most of the drive, turning it, looking at it, thinking about Clara Holt, who had taught in that building for 24 years and then locked it up one last day in June of 1971 and left this key with a man she trusted and said, "Give it to whoever comes." Whoever comes, as if she had known someone would. At Ruth's kitchen table over dinner, that neither of them talked much through. Mara held the key beside her plate and looked at it and did not know yet what it opened. She would find out. She was good at finding things out. She had been finding things out her whole life, one problem at a time, in the way you do when no one is going to do it for you. And the alternative is not finding them out, and that has never been an option she was willing to accept. But before she found out about the key, there was something she needed to understand. Something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since she had sat on that cardboard box in the driveway and counted her money and found it was $1 instead of $722. She knew Frank had taken it. She had known that from the moment she counted the way you know a thing before you have confirmed it in your body, before your mind catches up. But she had not yet allowed herself to think through the full shape of what that meant. The full shape of who Frank Kessler was and what he had been doing and for how long. That evening, while Ruth washed the dishes and Mara sat at the table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, Ruth said without turning from the sink, "There's something else you need to know." Mara looked up. Ruth turned off the water and dried her hands on the dish towel and turned around. She sat down across from Mara at the kitchen table and folded her hands on the surface and looked at her directly, the way Ruth looked at everything she considered important, with full attention, without flinching. "I should have told you this before," she said. "I've been thinking about whether to tell you for 6 months. I kept deciding it wasn't my business, and then deciding it was, and going back and forth, and I should have just told you." Mara waited. 3 months ago," Ruth said, "I ran into a woman named Patrice Halloway at the county courthouse. She works in property records. We've known each other 30 years. She mentioned as a matter of conversation that she had processed some paperwork involving your address." Ruth paused. "Frank Kessler filed a quiet title action in August. A legal process to establish sole ownership of the house, in his name only." Mara was still. "He started it 3 months ago," Ruth continued, "which means he was planning this, not just the padlock, the whole thing. He filed to remove your mother's name from the deed, and yours." She paused again. "But that's not the part I should have told you sooner." Mara waited. Patrice also mentioned that Frank had closed a joint savings account in August. An account in your mother's name and his. There was just over $14,000 in it. Ruth's voice was level, and she held Mara's gaze. "It was the money your mother had saved before she met Frank. She'd been adding to it since she was 22 years old. Frank knew about it, and he had been on the account for 6 years, and he closed it in August and moved the funds to an account in his name only." The kitchen was very quiet. Mara sat with this. She sat with the specific weight of it, which was not the weight of surprise, because she was not surprised, but the weight of confirmation, which is heavier than surprise, because it does not carry the counterbalance of disbelief. Frank had not just taken her $722. He had been systematically dismantling every financial foundation that existed around him. He had taken Vivian's $14,000. He had moved to seize the house. He had removed Mara on the same day as the final item. This was not cruelty in the impulsive sense. This was planning. This was a man who had looked at the people around him and done the math and executed. "My mother doesn't know," Mara said. It was not a question. "I don't know what your mother knows," Ruth said carefully. "I know what I know." Mara picked up the iron key from the table and held it in her hand. The metal was cool and certain against her palm. Outside, the wind had picked up in the birch trees, and she could hear the last leaves of the season moving against each other, dry and precise, the sound of October's ending. She thought about her mother standing at the sink, hands in the water, not moving. She thought about Vivian at 22, opening a savings account, putting money in it, adding to it, year by year, the way you build something you intend to keep. Before Frank. Before the house became a place where speaking made things worse, and silence was the only architecture that didn't crack. She thought about the schoolhouse, the worn stone step, the chalkboard, the dust floating in the light like something that had been waiting a very long time for the air to move. I'm going to need a place to sleep in Mill Haven, she said. Ruth looked at her. Something in her face changed, but only slightly. The thing that changed was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition. The school has a floor, she said. I know, Mara said. The floor is good. She set the key down on the table in front of her and looked at it. The bow, the bit, the leather cord gone stiff with age. Clara Holt had held this key, had held it in her hand and then placed it with a trusted man and said, "Give it to whoever comes." Mara did not know yet what it opened, but she was going to find out. She was 20 years old. She had $1 left, which she had already spent, which meant she had less than that. She had a cracked photograph and a backpack and a pair of work shoes and the particular quality of stillness that comes from 9 years of learning to endure. She had a building. She had a key. She had Ruth, who had the quality of a person who does not leave. Outside, the October wind moved through the birch trees, and the last leaves let go one by one and came down in the dark and settled on the cold ground. Inside the lamp on Ruth's kitchen table made a warm circle of light on the surface where the key lay iron and certain, and waiting the way certain things wait without impatience, because they have always known that eventually the right person would come. Mara picked up her cold tea and held it in both hands and looked at the key and began quietly to plan. She moved into the schoolhouse on a Friday. There was not much to move. The cardboard box from the driveway, her backpack, a sleeping bag Ruth pressed on her without discussion, army surplus, olive green, rated to 20 degrees. A battery lantern, a cast iron skillet Ruth took down from a hook in her kitchen and handed over with the same matter-of-fact directness she applied to everything, as if the gesture required no explanation, because it didn't. A thermos, a spiral notebook, and 3 pencils. Ruth drove her out to Mill Haven in the early morning, the valley still in shadow, the mountains catching the first light on their upper ridges while the road below stayed gray and cool. They did not talk much on the drive. They had said what needed saying. What came next was not talking. What came next was work. Corbett Finley was already at Greer's when they pulled up, unlocking the front door with his key ring and not appearing particularly surprised to see them. He handed Mara the deed paperwork without ceremony and pointed her to the notary block, and she signed where he indicated, and that was that. She owned a building. The building was worth, according to the county assessment, approximately $4,000. She had paid $1 for it, which meant she had gotten a return on her investment of 3,999% before she had done a single thing. Ruth thought this was funny. Mara did not disagree. They drove to the schoolhouse, and Ruth helped her carry in the sleeping bag and the skillet and the lantern. And then Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, at the dust and the cracked plaster and the rows of old desks and the chalkboard, and something moved in her face that she did not put words to. "I'll be back Thursday," Ruth said. "You need anything before then, you call." Mara said she would. Ruth's car disappeared around the bend in the road. The sound of the engine faded into the larger silence of the valley. Birds. Wind. The creek somewhere through the trees. Mara stood in the center of the schoolhouse, with the morning light coming through the dirty windows in long pale rectangles, and the dust still floating in the air where they had disturbed it. And she looked at the room, and the room looked back at her. She opened the notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she wrote foundation, roof walls, floor, heat, water, electric. She studied the list for a moment, then she underlined walls. The walls were where she would start. She had driven back to town the day before and gone to the county library, a small building attached to the back of the courthouse, and pulled every book they had on old building renovation. 4 books, 2 of them from the 1970s, 1 from 1988, 1 recent enough to have color photographs. She had sat at the library table for 5 hours, reading and taking notes, and then she had gone home to Ruth's and watched YouTube videos on her phone until the screen went dark from inactivity, and she woke it up and watched more. She knew now that the plaster in an old building like this one was applied in 3 coats over wood lath. The thin strips of wood nailed horizontally across the wall studs with a narrow gap between them. She knew the plaster in the back corner had failed because water had gotten in through the damaged window pane above it and wicked down through the wall cavity over many years, softening the lath and swelling the plaster from behind until it cracked and fell. She knew the repair would require pulling all the damaged material back to sound plaster, checking the studs behind it, repairing the window, then hanging drywall over the exposed section, and feathering the edges smooth. What she did not know, and could not know, until she opened the wall, was what she would find inside it. She put on the work gloves Ruth had included with the sleeping bag, along with a dust mask from the hardware section of Greer's that she had bought with the last of the cash in her jacket pocket. $4.73 that she had found in various pockets and the bottom of her backpack. Then she went to the back corner where the plaster had already failed, and she began. The plaster came off easily. Too easily in large, damp chunks that broke apart when they hit the floor and left white dust hanging in the air. Behind the plaster was the lath-thin strips of chestnut wood nailed with square-cut nails, the kind they stopped making in the early 20th century. Much of the lath was soft from the water damage, dark with old moisture. She pulled it away in pieces. It crumbled. Behind the lath were the studs, rough-cut oak, hand-hewn from local timber, still hard after 75 years. She checked them with her knuckle tapping along their length, listening for the hollow sound of rot. Solid. The water had damaged the surface materials, but it had not reached the structure. Between the studs, packed tight from floor to top plate, was newspaper. She had read about this. Before fiberglass insulation, before foam board, before any of the modern materials that existed specifically for the purpose, people insulated walls with whatever they had. Sawdust, straw, seaweed in coastal buildings, newspaper in places where a press ran, and the old issues piled up, and someone looked at the pile and looked at the cold wall and made a practical decision. The schoolhouse had been insulated with newspaper sometime in the late 1930s. She guessed from the dates on the pages crumpled and packed tight between the studs. Decades of local news and farm reports and obituaries and weather forecasts transformed into thermal mass. She pulled the newspaper out carefully, piece by piece. Some of it came out whole, the headlines still legible. County Fair records broken. New mine opens in Harlan. Europe. Situation worsens. She stacked the pieces on the floor. They were fragile and interesting, and she did not want to destroy them carelessly, which was something she felt about old things in general. She was working in the third stud bay, 4 feet up from the floor, when her hand touched something that was not newspaper. She stopped. She reached in slowly and felt around the edges of it. Flat, rectangular, metal, about the size of a large book, but thinner. She got her fingers around it and pulled it free from the newspaper packed around it. It was a tin, a rectangular cookie tin, the kind sold at Christmas with a lithographed lid showing a winter scene horses and a sleigh, a farmhouse with yellow windows. The tin was rusted at the corners where the seal between lid and body was imperfect, and the image on the lid had faded to near nothing, but the lid was tight. She tried it with her thumbs, and it opened with a soft resistance, the kind of seal that comes from years of gentle oxidation rather than deliberate locking. Inside, wrapped in a piece of waxed paper that had gone translucent with age, was money. Folded bills. Old ones, their paper soft and slightly wavy, held together with a piece of cotton kitchen twine. She unfolded them on her knee and counted. 5s and 10s and a few 20s. $340. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the money. Then she looked at the wall. Then she looked at the money again. She set the tin down carefully and went back to the wall. In the next stud bay, about the same height, she found another tin. This one had held tobacco, a Prince Albert can. The red and gold of it still faintly visible under the rust. Inside, $280 in small bills, wrapped in the same waxed paper with the same cotton twine. She sat with this for a moment. Then she stood up and looked at the full length of the back wall, 12 feet of it, and then she turned and looked at the side walls and the front wall with the chalkboard. And she understood, in the way you understand things that seem impossible until the evidence makes them inevitable, that there might be more. She went back to work. She worked through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon without stopping. She stripped the back wall completely, pulling every section of plaster and lath, pulling the newspaper out bay by bay. Her hands white with plaster dust, her eyes stinging even through the mask. The light changed in the room as the hours passed, moving from morning angles to the flat. Even light of midday to the longer, warmer light of afternoon. She did not notice the time. She noticed the tins. In the third bay of the back wall, a mason jar sealed with beeswax. The wax brown with age, cracked, carefully open, with a screwdriver to reveal $510 in coins and folded ones. In the fourth bay, a round tobacco canister, the lid pried open with her fingernails, $400. In the sixth bay, a small cloth pouch of silver dollars, each one wrapped individually in tissue paper that had gone the color of old cream, 32 coins, each one dated between 1921 and 1947. She stopped counting per container and began keeping a running total in the spiral notebook, the numbers adding up in her careful handwriting down the left margin of the page, while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the pile of empty tins and jars grew beside the door. She moved to the side walls. More tins, more jars. One wooden box pine dovetailed at the corners. The lid fitted so precisely, it took her 10 minutes to find the seam. Inside the box, a roll of bills, held with a rubber band that disintegrated when she touched it, $50 bills that fanned out across her lap. $1,500 in that one box. 2 canvas pouches, the kind banks once used for coin transport, stitched closed with heavy thread. She cut them open with her pocket knife. One held quarters and half dollars. The other held silver certificates, old paper currency, soft as cloth. She worked through the side walls, She worked through the front wall on both sides of the chalkboard. The chalkboard itself was mounted on a wood frame attached to the brick, and she did not touch it, but she worked the plaster on either side of it, around it, opening every stud bay she could reach. By the time the light through the windows had gone amber with late afternoon, she had opened every wall in the schoolhouse. She sat on the floor in the center of the room, surrounded by empty tins and jars and pouches, and the wooden box and piles of old newspaper and plaster dust, and she had the notebook open in her lap. 23 containers in total. She added the column a second time, slowly tapping each number with the pencil to make sure she had it right. $29,700. She sat with this number for a long time. The room was very quiet. Outside, the red oak was moving in a wind. She couldn't feel inside its remaining leaves, turning and catching the last light. A crow called once from somewhere on the ridge, and then was silent. The battery lantern she had switched on an hour ago cast a warm circle in the growing dusk, and, in its light, the empty tins on the floor had a strange, quiet beauty. The ordinary containers of a life lived carefully over many years. She picked up the notebook and looked at the number again. $29,700. Hidden in these walls, one container at a time, over 24 years of teaching in this building, by a woman who did not trust banks after what the Depression had done to her family. A woman who had lived, simply spent little, and saved what she could, and put it in the walls of the place she worked, and loved the way other people put money in the ground, or under mattresses, or in the hollows of trees. A woman who had understood on some level that what you put into the walls of a building becomes part of it. That buildings hold what is given to them. Clara Holt had given this building 24 years of her life and $29,700 and whatever else she had put into it that couldn't be counted. Mara looked up at the pressed tin ceiling. The floral pattern of each square panel, the white paint yellowed with age, still intact, still holding. She thought about the key. She had placed it on the windowsill when she arrived that morning in the rectangle of light from the east window, and it had been there all day, catching whatever light came through the dirty glass. She picked it up now and held it in her palm. The iron was warmer than it should have been from sitting in the sun. Or maybe that was just her hands. She turned it over, 3 inches long. Simple design. The bow, a plain circle, the bit, a simple rectangular cut. It had been made to open something specific, something that had been built to receive it, and she had not yet found what that was. She stood and walked the room slowly, lantern in hand, looking at the floor, the walls, the cabinetry, the stove. The small wooden cabinet by the stove, she had already opened the grade book and chalk and bell. No lock. The windows had simple latches, no key. The front door had a mortise lock, but it had clearly been opened with the larger key Corbett had given her with the deed paperwork. She went to the front of the room and stood at the chalkboard. The frame around it was substantial 2x4 pine, painted dark green to match the slate. She looked at the base of the frame where it met the floor. There was a small wooden step, a bevel of wood about 8 inches tall and 4 inches deep, the full width of the chalkboard that served as a base for the frame. She had assumed it was purely structural, a way of setting the frame level and giving it a solid base. She knelt down and looked at the step more carefully. On the right-hand end in the shadow, where the frame met the wall, there was a small iron plate, flush with the wood, and, in the center of the iron plate, a keyhole. Mara looked at the keyhole. She looked at the key in her hand. She put the key in. It turned. There was a soft mechanical click, the clean sound of a mechanism that had been made well and maintained its precision through decades of stillness. The front face of the bevel swung forward on a piano hinge. a door 4 inches tall, and the full width of the chalkboard opening to reveal a shallow horizontal cavity that ran the full length of the frame's base. Inside the cavity, lying flat, was a book. Not a tin, not a jar, a book. Bound in dark green cloth, the same green as the chalkboard frame, which she realized now was not coincidental. The cloth was smooth under her fingers, slightly worn at the spine corners, the binding tight. The pages were thick and cream colored, and when she lifted it out, it was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the nearest desk and set it down and opened it. It was a journal, handwritten, careful slanting cursive, the letters consistent and precise, the hand of a person who had written a great deal and taken care with all of it. The first entry was dated September 4th, 1947. First day, 9 students. The youngest is 4 years old. A boy named Doyle Prater, who kept falling asleep at his desk before 10 o'clock. His older sister, who is 7, kept waking him by poking him with a pencil. I told her to let him sleep. He will learn what he needs to learn when he is ready. That is true of all of them. Mara sat down in the desk chair, the old teacher's chair at the front of the room, and she read. She read for 2 hours. Clara Holt had kept this journal for every day of school for 24 years. Not every entry was long. Some were a single line. October 14th, 1951. Cold this morning. Brought extra wood. The Caudille children walked 3 miles with no coats. I gave them the spare ones from the back cabinet. Some were several pages, the handwriting unchanged in pace or precision, the observations of a person who paid close attention and believed that attention was itself a form of care. She wrote about the children as individuals, not as types, not as problems, not as data, as people. She wrote about their specific qualities, their particular ways of thinking, what made each of them difficult, and what made each of them extraordinary. She wrote about their families, the mining accidents, and the floods and the seasons. When the work dried up and the children came to school hungry, and she fed them from her own kitchen, which she could barely afford, but which she did not mention in terms of cost, because that was not how she thought about it. She wrote about the building, about the winter when the pipes froze and burst, and she and 3 fathers from town spent a weekend repairing them. About the summer she rechinked the mortar on the north face of the brick with a mixture she had read about in a library book. About the year she saved enough to buy a second-hand set of encyclopedias from a school in Lexington that was replacing its reference library, and drove there and back in a borrowed truck with the books stacked in the bed under a tarp. She wrote about the money, not in the early years. The first mention was in 1953. Put aside $40 this month. I don't trust the Harlan First National after what happened to my father in 33. The building is the safest place I know. She wrote about it without drama, the way she wrote about everything as a practical fact. She was saving. She was putting it somewhere safe. She was not spending what she did not need because she did not want what she did not need. The last entry was dated June 11th, 1971, the day the school closed. The county came and took the books and the supplies. This morning, 2 men in a county truck who worked with professional efficiency and no conversation. They did not look at the room as anything other than a task to be completed. I suppose that is what it is to them. It is not what it is to me. I have been in this room every school day for 24 years. I have stood at that chalkboard and watched 47 different children learn to read, and 22 of them learn to love reading, which is a different thing entirely and the better achievement. I have failed some of them. I have failed them in the ways that are inevitable when one person tries to meet the needs of 9 or 12 or 15 children of different ages and abilities at the same time. But I have not failed them by not trying. That I know. The money is in the walls, all of it. I have written instructions and sealed them in a letter behind the chalkboard for whoever comes next. I have left the key with Corbett Finley, who is a man of reliability and no wasted words. I do not know when someone will come. I do not know who they will be. But a schoolhouse is a building that teaches patience. I have learned from it. I leave it in good faith. Clara Holt, June 11th, 1971. Mara sat with the journal closed in her lap for a long time. The lantern was the only light in the room now. Outside, it was full dark, the October night, pressing against the old windows, and the stars over Millhaven were the kind of stars you only see far from cities dense and absolute. The whole arm of the galaxy visible if you knew where to look. She went back to the chalkboard compartment and looked inside once more. The journal had been the primary contents, but she had not fully examined the back of the cavity. She reached in now and felt along the base, and in the far left corner, her fingers found a flat rectangle. An envelope. Sealed with wax, the wax still intact, after 53 years in this dry, shallow space. She brought it out carefully and looked at it. On the front, in Clara's handwriting, "To whoever finds this." She opened it carefully, working her fingernail under the wax seal without breaking the envelope. Inside was a single page of schoolhouse letterhead, the school's name printed at the top in a simple typeface, Millhaven District School. And, below it, in Clara's careful hand, "My name is Clara Holt. I have taught in this school for 24 years. In that time, the people of this town gave me more than I could ever repay. They trusted me with their children, which is the greatest gift a community can give. I saved what I could from my salary and put it in the walls of this building. I did not trust banks after what happened to my parents. I did not need much. I lived simply, and I was happy. This money belongs to the school. If the school closes, it belongs to whoever takes care of this building next. A schoolhouse is a place where people learn to become themselves. That does not stop being needed. I have also left a journal of my years here. It is not important in the way money is important. It is important in the way that records of honest work are important, which is a different kind of importance and one I set more store by. Take care of this building. Take care of whoever comes to it needing something. Clara Holt, June 1971. Mara read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it against her chest and sat very still in the old teacher's chair while the lantern light moved in the draft from under the door and the darkness outside the tall windows held everything the way darkness holds things at the end of a long day, not threatening, just present. She thought about Clara Holt, who had been 22 years old in 1947 when she started, and who had stayed in this room for 24 years and put her money in its walls, one container at a time, year after year, the way you build something you intend to last. A woman who had looked at the world and decided that the most useful thing she could do with her time on earth was stand in front of children and show them what learning looked like and what it could give them. She thought about the journal. 47 children over 24 years. Their names carefully recorded, their particular qualities observed and noted and taken seriously. She thought about what it meant to be seen that way, to be in a room with a person who paid attention to you as an individual, who understood that you were not interchangeable with the other children around you who held the specifics of you in mind day after day. She thought about Sinclair's diner, the regulars who came in every morning and sat in their booths and ordered the same thing. She had liked that place for the same reason, the predictability of it, the way things made sense there, the way people were where they were supposed to be. But it was not enough. A diner is a place where people rest in passing. A school is a place where people change. She thought about Ruth. She picked up her phone and called. Ruth answered on the first ring. I found the letter, Mara said, and a journal. 24 years of teaching. She paused. And the money. $29,700, Ruth. In the walls. Silence on the line. A long silence. There's something else, Mara said. The journal. There's an entry about a student. 1964. A girl 14 years old. Father worked the mines. She stopped. She could hear Ruth's breathing on the other end of the line. She wrote about a student named Ruth A. Mara said carefully. She wrote that this student was the smartest child she had ever taught, that she kept skipping school and Clara kept going to get her and bringing her back, that she never gave up on her. Mara looked at the journal in her lap. She wrote that this student was the one she worried about most, because the ones with that much in them, if they don't find a way out, it costs more. The ones with less to lose can afford to stay. The silence on the line was very long. Then Ruth said in a voice that was different from her usual voice, older somehow and quieter. She used to walk to my house when I didn't come in. 3 miles. In any weather. She would knock on the door, and my mother would let her in, and she would sit at our kitchen table and wait for me to come downstairs. A pause. I always came down eventually. I never knew why she bothered. She wrote why, Mara said. She wrote it down in 1964, and she kept the journal in the wall for 50 years. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Read it to me." Mara opened the journal to the page she had marked with a slip of newspaper. The handwriting was the same as always, careful and consistent Claire's voice exactly as it was in every other entry, paying attention, taking seriously, holding the specific details of a specific person in mind. She read it. When she finished, neither of them said anything for a while. The lantern made its small circle of light in the empty room. The journal was open in Mara's lap. Outside, the October dark was total and complete and full of stars. Finally, Ruth said, "She left me a note, the day the school closed." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was deliberate. She pressed a piece of paper into my hand and said, "Don't open it until you're ready to do something about it." I was 17. I thought I knew what she meant. A pause. I opened it 6 months later. It had the name and address of a community college in Lexington, and one sentence. Ruth stopped. "What did it say?" Mara asked. "You are smarter than this valley knows. Go prove it." A breath. I went. I finished my degree. I taught school myself for 31 years, junior high English down in Pikeville. A pause that held more than the words around it. I never told Clara. She died before I had figured out how to say it. Mara sat with this. The weight of it, all the things that do not get said in time, and then cannot be said at all, and have to be carried instead. She knew, Mara said. She wrote it down in 1971, in the last entry. She wrote that she hoped the ones she had worried about most had found their way through. She looked at the page. She wrote your name. She said she hoped Ruth A. had found out what she was worth. The silence on the phone was the good kind of silence. The kind that comes after something true has been said, and the truth needs room. After a long moment, Ruth said, "How are you doing out there?" Mara looked around the room, the empty tins in a pile by the door, the newspaper stacked carefully against the wall, the exposed studs where the plaster had been, the hand-hewn oak of them still solid and straight after 75 years. The chalkboard dark at the front of the room, the old desks in their rows, patient as they had always been. "Good," she said, and meant it. There's a hardware store in Cumberland, Ruth said. I'll pick you up at 8. I'll be ready, Mara said. She closed the phone and set it on the desk beside her. She sat in Claire's chair for a while longer, the journal in her lap, the lantern burning down toward its limit. The money was still on the floor in its various containers. The bills and coins sorted loosely by denomination. $29,700 that had been sitting in these walls since the last of it was put there sometime in the late 1960s. She would need to decide what to do with it, not tonight. Tonight she needed to sleep and let the day settle and let the full shape of things come clear, the way things only come clear after you stop pushing at them. She unrolled the sleeping bag in the space behind the desks and took off her boots and lay down on the old oak floor with Claire's journal beside her and the lantern turned low and the October night pressing against the old glass of the tall windows. The floor was hard. It was exactly as hard as a 75-year-old oak floor is hard, which is hard in the way of something that has no give because it has already given what it had to give, and what remains is what endures. She lay on it and felt it against her back and found to her mild surprise that it was not uncomfortable. It was honest. It was a surface that told you exactly what it was. She thought about Clara putting the first tin in the wall in 1953. $40. The stud bay carefully packed back with newspaper, the plaster replaced, the seam smoothed, going back the next year and doing it again. And the year after. Building something over 2 decades that no one knew about and that asked nothing except to be held by these walls. She thought about her mother standing at the sink, hands in the water. She thought about Frank Kessler, who had looked at the people around him and done the math. She thought about Corbett Finley placing the key on the counter without explanation in the manner of a man fulfilling an obligation he had held for 50 years. The simple transaction of it, the old iron key on the worn wood counter, $1 beside it, and both of them meaning far more than they cost. Outside, a screech owl called from the red oak, a long descending tremolo that rose at the end, the sound of a creature that hunts in the dark and is not afraid of it. The sound moved through the old glass of the windows and into the room and lay over the silence for a moment, and then faded. Mara closed her eyes. She was 20 years old, and she was lying on the floor of a building she owned surrounded by money she had not expected, and a journal written by a woman she had never met, who had spent her life paying attention to people that the world was not paying enough attention to. She thought about what Clara had written in that last entry. A schoolhouse is a building that teaches patience. The lantern clicked off when its battery reached the end of its charge, and the room went dark, and through the tall windows, the stars over Millhaven were very bright and very clear. And Mara lay on the old oak floor and slept without dreaming the deep and complete sleep of a person who has found at the end of a long day of work that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The first thing she fixed was the window, not because it was the most important thing, because it was the most immediate. The missing pane in the back corner had let weather into the wall for years, and the wall had paid for it, and now she was paying for it. And the first principle of fixing an old building is that you stop whatever is still causing damage before you address the damage already done. You close the wound before you treat it. She bought glass at the hardware store in Cumberland, a single pane, cut to size and glazing compound, in a small can, and a glazing tool she did not know how to use until she watched a 12-minute video in the parking lot of the hardware store before driving back. The repair took her most of a morning. Her first attempt at running the compound bead was lumpy and uneven, and she scraped it out with a putty knife and started again. The second attempt was better. Not good, but better. The third was good enough that the glass held and the seal was tight, and the corner of the room was closed against the weather for the first time in years. She stood back and looked at it. A single pane of glass, clean and level and sealed. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic, but it meant the wall behind it could begin to dry, and a wall that is drying is a wall that is healing, and that seemed like the right place to begin. She worked through October into November. The days shortened and the temperature dropped, and she worked inside, mostly pulling the remaining damaged plaster from the walls, checking studs, pulling old newspaper, and replacing it all with fiberglass, insulation bats. She cut to size with a utility knife on the floor, then covering the walls with new drywall. She hung herself one panel at a time, learning as she went. The first panel she hung alone was crooked by 3/8 of an inch at the top corner, and she shimmed it twice before it sat flush. The taping and mudding she learned from a retired contractor in Ohio, who ran a YouTube channel with the specific patient energy of a man who had made every mistake himself and wanted you to make fewer of them. The first wall she finished looked like the work of someone who had never done it before, which it was. The seams were visible under raking light, the mud built up unevenly, the texture inconsistent. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got the corner knife and the compound, and she skimmed the entire surface again, thin and even, and let it dry, and sanded it, and skimmed it once more, and when the second coat dried and she ran her hand across it, it was smooth. She kept the chalkboard. She cleaned it with white vinegar and soft cloths, working the slate in slow circles until the surface was clean and dark and even. She kept the pressed tin ceiling, which needed nothing but a wash. She kept every one of the old school desks, cleaning each one with linseed oil, on a rag, working the oil into the dry wood until the grain opened up and the color came back, the pale honey color of old oak that has been well used and well maintained. The floor she saved for last. She rented a drum sander from a tool rental place in Harlan and worked the center of the floor on her knees, wearing ear protection and a dust mask. The machine pulling hard against her hands on the first pass, the coarse paper taking the old finish, and the gray surface layer off in long curling strips. The oak underneath was extraordinary. Pale gold, dense-grained, tight as stone. She sanded the edges with a hand sander on her knees for 2 days, working along the baseboards and into the corners. And when every inch of the floor had been sanded to bare wood, she swept it twice and tacked it with a damp cloth and opened the first can of oil-based polyurethane. She applied 3 coats, 24 hours between each, windows open to the cold November air. After the third coat, she let it cure for 4 days without walking on it, coming in only through the front door and standing on the threshold to check the surface, watching the finish build its depth. The grain of the old oak deepening under each coat until it looked less like a floor and more like amber, something that had been formed over a long time, under pressure, and was now showing what it was made of. On the 4th morning, she took off her boots at the door and stepped onto the floor in her socks. She had expected it to be good. She had not expected what it actually was. The floor was glass. The floor was 75 years of oak that had been walked on by generations of children and then sanded back to its beginning and finished with care. And the result was something that did not feel like a surface underfoot, but like the absence of friction, like walking on still water. She stood in the center of the room in her socks and turned slowly, and the light from the tall windows came down in long rectangles, and the floor gave it back doubled. She stood there for a long time. Then she went outside and sat on the stone step and looked at the hayfield across the stone wall and let herself feel what she felt, which was something she had not had much practice at, feeling things openly without immediately putting them away. What she felt was not happiness exactly. It was older and quieter than happiness. It was the feeling of having made something real with her hands in a place that was hers and finding that the making had been worth the cost of it. The potbelly stove she had inspected by a man named Garland Sykes from Harlan, who had been servicing wood stoves since 1979, and who tapped the iron sides of the stove with a small hammer and listened to the sound with his eyes closed, and then announced that the stove was sound and the flue was clear, and the only thing it needed was a new rope gasket around the door, which he installed in 20 minutes with a tube of stove cement and the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is doing. He charged her $40. She paid it without comment. She bought a cord of seasoned oak from a farmer named Dewey Skaggs, whose land ran along the creek a half-mile west of town, and who delivered it in a pickup and stacked it against the south wall of the schoolhouse without being asked to, which told her something about Millhaven that she had already been beginning to understand. She split the smaller pieces herself with a maul she bought secondhand at Greer's and stacked them inside near the stove and lit the first fire on a cold Thursday evening in the second week of November. The stove heated the room in 20 minutes. She sat on the floor in front of it with Clara's journal in her lap and the firelight moving on the tin ceiling above her and the windows dark with the outside cold. And she felt the warmth spreading out from the iron body of the stove in waves, the pressed tin ceiling catching it and holding it and returning it to the room, and the room that had been cold and empty for 50 years was warm. She hired an electrician from Cumberland named Boyd Prentice, who ran service from the road and installed a breaker panel beside the front door in a day and a half and charged her $800, which she paid from the money Clara had left. She hired a plumber from Harlan named Garrett, who connected to the town's water main and installed a small septic system in 3 days of work that involved a backhoe and a great deal of mud, and Garrett explaining things to her at length because she asked questions, and he was a man who liked being asked questions by people who actually listened to the answers. The kitchen she built herself along the back wall where the coat hooks had been, a simple counter of white pine boards sealed with polyurethane, a stainless sink, a 2-burner gas range she found at a secondhand appliance store in Harlan for $60 and transported in the back of Ruth's Subaru with the rear seats folded down, a compact refrigerator. She tiled the backsplash with white subway tiles she found on clearance, cutting them with a rented wet saw in the parking lot of Greer's, learning the saw's particular resistance and the way the tile wanted to chip at the edge if you pushed too fast. The bathroom she framed in the southeast corner. New studs, new drywall, a pocket door she hung herself after watching the same video 4 times. She tiled the shower with small white hex tiles from the same clearance lot as the backsplash. 4 days of work on her knees with a trowel and a bucket of thinset, getting the spacing, even keeping the rows level, grouting with white grout. She mixed herself to the consistency the instructions described as peanut butter, which she found to be accurate. When the grout cured and she turned on the shower for the first time, and the hot water hit the white tile and steam rose toward the ceiling, she stood in the doorway of the small bathroom and watched it, and felt something she recognized but could not immediately name. Then she named it. She had built this. She had not known how to build this 60 days ago. She had learned how to build this by reading and watching and making mistakes and making them again and making them differently the third time until the mistakes became lessons and the lessons became competence. Nobody had given it to her. Nobody could take it away. It existed in her hands now, in the specific knowledge of her hands, in the way her body knew the weight of a trowel and the angle of a mud knife and the tension of a drum sander. And that was a different kind of possession than the money. more permanent, more intrinsic. She arranged the open room without walls defining spaces by use and furniture. The front half near the chalkboard she kept as living space. She placed 6 of the old school desks as side tables and display surfaces. Ruth brought her a deep green velvet couch from her spare room that she said she had been meaning to get rid of for years. An overstatement they both understood was generous fiction. Mara positioned it facing the stove. She built bookshelves from pine boards and steel brackets along the east wall and filled them with books from the Harlan County Library book sale, filling 2 paper bags for $5. She hung the photograph of her grandmother on the wall beside the chalkboard where the old U.S. map had been tacked for decades. Her grandmother had been a school teacher in New Hampshire in the 1950s, a connection Mara had not thought about until she stood in this room and understood that it was exactly the right place for the photograph, that the school and the woman belonged together. In a way she could feel but not fully articulate, which is often the truest sign that something is correct. The sleeping area she arranged in the back half behind a tall bookshelf she built as a room divider. Her bed was a mattress on a simple frame she made from 2x6 spruce, sanded smooth and sealed with beeswax. The window beside her bed looked out at the red oak, whose leaves had all fallen. Now the branches bare against the gray November sky, the tree showing its true structure, the way trees always reveal more in winter, the architecture of them visible only when the decoration is gone. Corbett Finley came by on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the doorway with a paper bag from Greer's containing 2 apples and looked at the room for a long time without speaking. He walked the length of the floor, running his hand along the cleaned desks. He looked at the chalkboard. He looked at the stove and the bookshelves and the framed photograph. Clara would have approved, he said finally. He said it the same way he said most things, as a statement of fact that did not require elaboration, because elaboration would not have improved it. He left the apples on the counter. The people of Mill Haven came gradually after that, the way small town people come to things carefully with their offerings. A woman named Beulah Combs brought a braided rug she had made herself, oval navy and rust, and placed it in front of the stove without asking where Mara wanted it, which turned out to be exactly where Mara wanted it. A man named Harlan Goff, whose father had been among Clara's early students, brought a rocking chair his father had built the wood, dark with age and used the joints tight. An elderly couple named the Barlows, whose children had been in Clara's last classes, brought a photograph, black and white, taken in 1965, showing Clara standing at the chalkboard with her back half turned toward the camera, pointing at something written on the slate, and the classroom full of children all looking at the board with the concentrated attention that only children can produce, the whole weight of their young minds directed at the single point Clara was indicating. Mara hung the photograph beside her grandmother's. 2 women standing in front of chalkboards decades apart, in different schools, in different states. The same posture, the same work, the same faith that what happens in a room where someone pays attention to children is worth the cost of the doing. The first hard snow came in the second week of November. Not a dusting. A serious snow 8 inches overnight, the kind that arrives without apology and stays. Mara woke to it in the gray early light, the room colder than usual despite the bank stove, and she lay in bed and listened to the silence that snow creates, the particular, muffled quiet of a world that has been covered and is holding its breath. She got up and built the fire back up and made coffee and stood at the window and watched the snow on the hayfield across the stone wall and the snow on the branches of the bare red oak and the snow on the slate roof of the church she could see at the far end of the road. Everything was white and still. She was warm. She had been standing at the window for 20 minutes when she heard the car. It came from the north, from the direction of the main road, moving slowly on the unplowed gravel, and it pulled up in front of the schoolhouse and stopped, and she heard the engine cut, and she watched the driver's door open, and she saw her mother get out. Vivienne Linden stood in the snow beside her car and looked at the schoolhouse. She was wearing a coat Mara didn't recognize dark blue wool, and her hair was different shorter than Mara remembered. And she stood in the snow with her hands at her sides and looked at the building with an expression that Mara, watching from the window, could not read. Mara opened the front door. They looked at each other across the stone step. Vivienne had aged, not dramatically, not the way people age in stories when crisis visits them, but in the way of a person who has been under sustained pressure for a long time and is now visibly out from under it. There were lines in her face that Mara did not remember, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in years. The absence in them, that quality of looking at nothing from a great interior distance, was different now. Not gone entirely, but lessened. I should have called, Vivienne said. It's okay, Mara said. It's not. Vivienne stood in the snow and looked at her directly. None of it is. I know that. Mara stepped back from the door. Come in. Vivienne came in. She stood inside the door and looked at the room, slowly taking it in the way someone looks at a place when they are genuinely trying to see it, rather than simply registering its presence. The floor, the chalkboard, the stove with the fire going, the Barlow photograph on the wall, the bookshelves, the velvet couch, the window light coming in clean and warm, the old tin ceiling above it all. She looked at it for a long time. You did all of this, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Vivienne turned and looked at her daughter. Something moved across her face, complicated and real, and not subject to easy naming. I didn't know you could do any of this. Neither did I, Mara said. She made coffee, and they sat at the counter on two stools Mara had found at an estate sale in Harlan, and Vivienne told her. Frank had been arrested in October, not for what he had done to Vivienne's savings, not for the quiet title action, not for any of the things he had done to the people in his immediate orbit, because those required Vivienne to file complaints, and she had not yet found the steadiness for that. He had been arrested for a pattern of insurance fraud in his commercial accounts, a scheme he had been running for several years that had drawn the attention of the state insurance commissioner and then a federal investigator. And when the investigation reached its conclusion, it did so quickly and completely the way these things do, when the evidence has been building for a long time. He was facing charges that would occupy his time and money for years. Vivienne had gone to stay with her sister in Lexington. She had been there for a month. She had talked to a lawyer about the savings account, about the deed, about the full accounting of what Frank had taken and how. The lawyer had not been optimistic about the savings account, but had said the deed action could be challenged. It would take time. She said all of this sitting at Mara's counter, with both hands around her coffee cup, not looking away, not retreating into the middle distance. She said it the way someone says things when they have decided to stop performing composure and simply be where they are. Mara listened. When Vivienne finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I want to explain about the day you came home. You don't have to, Mara said. I do. Vivienne looked at the counter, then back up. I heard his voice, and I went somewhere else. I have been going somewhere else when I hear his voice for years, because going somewhere else was the only way to stay in one piece. She paused. But you needed me to stay, and I didn't. I know that. The room was quiet. The stove ticked as the iron expanded in the heat. Outside, the snow was still falling lighter, now the flakes smaller and less deliberate. Mara looked at her mother, at the woman who had once sung in the car and made soup from scratch and had a laugh that came from somewhere real. The woman who had been erased slowly by a man who needed to be the only real thing in any room he occupied. She was not fully back, that woman. Maybe she would not come fully back. But she was here, sitting on a stool in Mara's kitchen in Millhaven, in the snow, holding her coffee with both hands, looking at her daughter without looking away. That was something. I know, Mara said. They did not fix everything that morning. Some things cannot be fixed in a morning. Some things require more time and more honesty and more mornings than one, and both of them understood this without having to say it. What they did instead was simpler and more durable. They sat together in Mara's kitchen and drank coffee and talked, not about Frank, not about the past 9 years, but about smaller things. The floor, the stove, the tin ceiling, how Mara had learned to tile. Vivian asked questions, and Mara answered them, and Vivian listened in the way she had not listened in a long time, with full presence, without the interior retreat, without the performed composure that had stood in place of real attention for so many years. It was, Mara thought, a beginning, not a resolution. A beginning, which was the right thing for a schoolhouse. Ruth came on Thursday, as she had said she would. She arrived at 8 in the morning in the dark green Subaru with a thermos of coffee and a bag of groceries, and stood in the doorway and looked at the room the way she had looked at it before, but differently this time, less like assessment, more like recognition. She walked slowly to the front of the room and stood before the chalkboard. She reached out and touched the frame with one hand, her fingers resting on the dark green wood. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, I sat in the third desk from the front on the left side. She said it quietly. Right there, every day for 3 years. Mara did not say anything. She used to stand right here. Ruth pointed to a spot on the floor in front of the chalkboard. The worn place in the oak that 60 years of a teacher's weight had left the wood there, slightly smoother than the rest, the grain compressed by the decades of standing. Right here, every morning. She stood in that spot for a moment, in Claire's place, her hand still on the frame. Then she turned, and her eyes found the 2 photographs on the wall. The 1965 classroom photograph with Clara at the board, and Mara's grandmother in New Hampshire, with her chalk-dusted hands and her straight back. Ruth looked at them both for a long time. The journal, she said. The entry from 1964. You read it to me on the phone. Yes. I want to read it myself, if that's all right. Mara got the journal from the shelf and brought it to Ruth and opened it to the page. Ruth took it in both hands and read. She read slowly the way she read everything with full attention. When she finished, she stood with the journal in her hands and her head slightly bent. Then she said, 60 years. She wrote this 60 years ago, and it's been sitting in that wall waiting. She looked up. She knew, didn't she? She knew exactly what each of us was worth. She just never got to see what we did with it. She knew about you, Mara said. She wrote about you in 1971, too. The last entry. Ruth looked at her. She wrote that she hoped the ones who had the most in them had found a way to use it. She wrote your name. Mara paused. She said she would have liked to know how things turned out. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she closed the journal carefully and held it against her chest and stood in front of Claire's chalkboard. And her eyes were bright with something she did not try to explain and did not need to. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky over Millhaven had cleared to a thin, pale blue. The winter blue, and the sun was coming through the tall windows at a low angle. The December angle, long and warm and oblique, falling across the floor in the shapes that the windows made sharp-edged and golden. Ruth set the journal back on the shelf and turned to Mara and said in her ordinary voice, the voice she used for things she had decided I want to tell you something about why I brought you here. Mara waited. Clara gave me a way out, Ruth said. That note she pressed into my hand, the community college, the sentence about being smarter than the valley knew. She looked at the floor. I went to Lexington because of that note. I got my degree because of that note. I taught school for 31 years because of that note. And for 50 years, I have been trying to figure out how to pay it back, and there is no way to pay it back to the person who gave it, because she is gone. She looked up. But there are other ways. She looked at Mara steadily. I brought you here because you needed somewhere that was yours, and because this building needed someone who would see it for what it was, and because Clara spent 24 years doing what she did, and I have spent 60 years knowing it and not doing enough with the knowing. She paused. This was what I could do. This was the thing I could hand to someone the way she once handed something to me. The room was very quiet. Mara stood in the center of her floor, the floor she had sanded and sealed with 3 coats of oil-based polyurethane and let cure for 4 days. The floor that was golden in the winter light, coming through the tall, clean windows. And she looked at Ruth and understood that some debts do not get repaid to the person who created them, only forwarded, passed along like a tool, from hand to hand, arriving finally in the hands of whoever needs it most. She thought about Clara putting the first $40 in the wall in 1953. 110 in the stud bay, packed around with newspaper, the plaster replaced, the seams smoothed. Going back the next year. And the year after. Building something over 2 decades that nobody knew about and that asked nothing. She thought about Ruth at 14, skipping school because being present in your life sometimes requires more courage than being absent from it, and a woman walking 3 miles in any weather to knock on the door and sit at the kitchen table and wait because she had decided this particular girl was worth the 3 miles. She thought about her grandmother in the photograph on the wall, the chalk on her fingers, the straight back, the expression of a woman who had decided that what she was doing was worth doing and was not asking for agreement on the question. She thought about her mother sitting at the counter 2 days ago with both hands around her coffee cup, looking at her daughter without looking away. She walked to the front of the room and picked up a piece of chalk from the tray at the base of the board. White chalk, short, the end worn. She turned to face the dark slate and wrote in the center of the board, her letters careful and deliberate. This school is open. She set the chalk back in the tray and turned around. Ruth was looking at the board. Something in her face was open in a way that faces rarely are, the careful composure of a long life laid aside for a moment. And what was underneath it was not grief and not happiness, but something that contained both of them, and was therefore more than either. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire in the stove made its small, steady sounds. The winter light moved imperceptibly across the floor as the earth turned. The next morning, Mara was at the counter with her coffee when she heard the knock. She opened the front door. A man stood on the stone step. He was in his 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas work coat and boots that had seen serious use. He was holding his hat in his hands, working the brim with his fingers, the way men do when they have come to ask something and are not certain of the reception. Beside him stood a girl. She was 8 years old, maybe 9, small and dark-haired, wearing a coat that was slightly too big for her with the sleeves turned up. She was looking at the schoolhouse with the particular quality of attention that children direct at things they have been told about and are now seeing for the first time. The man said, "I heard you might be opening the school back up." His voice was careful, the voice of someone who has been told no before and has not stopped asking. Mara looked at him, then at the girl. "My daughter," the man said. She's having trouble, reading and such. There's nothing around here. He paused. I heard about what you're doing out here. I thought maybe. He stopped. Tried again. I don't know what you're charging. I can work. I'm a carpenter, if you need anything built. The girl was looking at the classroom behind Mara, looking at the desks, the chalkboard, the bookshelves and the photographs and the stove and the floor that was golden in the morning light. Mara stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. The man stepped inside. The girl followed. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at everything with that concentrated attention that children direct at things that are speaking to them in some frequency only they can hear. She looked at the desks. She walked to the nearest one and ran her hand along the surface, the wood warm and smooth under her fingers, the grain opening under her palm. She looked up at Mara. Is this where we sit? She asked. Mara looked at the desk. She looked at the chalkboard behind her, at the words she had written there the evening before, the white chalk letters on the dark slate. This school is open. She looked at the girl who was 8 or 9 years old and having trouble reading, and who had been brought here by a man in a worn work coat, who held his hat in his hands and offered what he had. She thought about Clara Holt walking 3 miles in any weather to knock on a door and wait. She thought about Ruth at 14 coming down the stairs, because she always came down eventually. She thought about a woman who had put $40 in a wall in 1953 and come back the next year and the year after, because she had decided that this place and these children were worth the long patience of it. She thought about the stone step worn smooth in the center by 100 years of children's feet. Yes, Mara said. That's where you sit. The girl sat down. She put her hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the chalkboard with the attentive seriousness of a person who has decided to be present fully for what comes next. Outside, the winter sun was climbing over the ridge, and the snow in the hayfield was bright and unmarked, and the red oak beside the schoolhouse was bare against the pale sky, its branches holding the cold light, every line of it visible, every fork and twig, and the deep, patient architecture of it revealed now that all the decoration had fallen away, and what remained was only what was real. Mara walked to the chalkboard. She picked up a piece of chalk. She looked at the girl in the third desk from the front, who was looking back at her with the open, waiting attention of someone at the beginning of something. She began.